They did not set out to build a killing machine. That is the part that gets lost in the history. The men who gathered in Paris in 1789 to dismantle the old order were, by and large, lawyers and writers and doctors and local officials, men of the Enlightenment, men who had read Rousseau and Voltaire and believed, with the particular intensity of people who have read the right books at the right moment, that reason could replace tyranny, that a society organized around rational principles and the rights of man would be more just, more stable, and more humane than anything the monarchy had produced. 4 years later, the guillotine in the Place de la Révolution was processing 12 executions a day. The French Revolution's descent into the terror is one of history's most studied and least understood transformations. Least understood because it is so difficult to accept that it was not an accident, not a deviation, not the revolution being hijacked by extremists who appeared from outside it. The terror grew from the revolution the way a shadow grows from a figure in the sun. It was produced by the same idealism, the same logic, the same structural conditions that produced the Declaration of the Rights of Man. To understand how, you have to look not at the monsters, but at the mechanisms. The revolution began with a genuine crisis of legitimacy. The Ancien Régime, the system of absolute monarchy, hereditary aristocracy, and clerical privilege that had governed France for centuries, had not simply become unjust. It had become insolvent. Louis XVI convened the Estates General in 1789 because the French state was bankrupt, not because he had been persuaded of the rights of man. The financial collapse created the opening, and into that opening poured everything that had been building in French society. The resentment of the bourgeoisie excluded from power, the desperation of the peasantry crushed by taxation, the intellectual energy of the philosophes who had spent decades arguing that the existing order was irrational and replaceable. The early revolution, the revolution of 1789 and 1790, was an extraordinary political achievement. The declaration of the rights of man and citizen, the abolition of feudalism, the reorganization of the French state along rational administrative lines. These were not minor reforms. They were a fundamental restructuring of the relationship between the state and the individual, and they were accomplished with a speed that astonished Europe. But speed was also the problem. The revolution dismantled the old institutions faster than it could build new ones. The church, which had provided social cohesion and local administration across the country, was nationalized and its authority broken. The aristocracy, which had provided the officer class of the army and the administrative class of the provinces, was abolished or driven into exile. The monarchy itself was suspended, then abolished, then the king was tried and executed in January 1793. Each of these acts was, within the revolution's own logic, necessary and defensible. The old order had to go, but each act also removed a load-bearing structure without having a replacement ready, and the void left behind was filled not with the rational institutions the revolutionaries had imagined, but with something more improvised, more anxious, and more dangerous: committees. The Committee of Public Safety, established in April 1793, was the institutional heart of the terror. It was a war council initially. France was at war with Austria and Prussia. The émigré aristocrats were organizing counter-revolutionary armies on the borders, and the Vendée region in the west was in open royalist revolt. The committee was given extraordinary powers to respond to these extraordinary threats, and in the beginning it used those powers with something resembling strategic rationality. But the committee operated inside a logic that contained within it a fatal mechanism. The revolution had defined itself against an enemy: the forces of the old order, the aristocracy, the foreign powers, the counter-revolution. In the early years, this enemy was concrete and identifiable. As the external threats were managed and the most obvious internal opponents were dealt with, the definition of the enemy did not contract. It expanded. It had to expand because the revolution's logic required an enemy. The purity of the Republican ideal demanded that any failure, any difficulty, any shortfall between the promised world and the actual one had to be explained by the continued existence of enemies who were sabotaging it. This is not a uniquely French pathology. It is a structural feature of revolutionary movements that define themselves through opposition rather than through construction. Once the original enemy has been defeated or removed, the movement faces a choice: accept that the world is complex and that the ideal will be imperfectly realized, or maintain the purity of the original vision by finding new enemies sufficient to explain the imperfection. Robespierre and the committee chose the second path, not because they were uniquely cruel by the standards of his time and his class. Robespierre was austere, personally incorruptible, and genuinely committed to the principles he articulated. He was called the Incorruptible precisely because he appeared to mean what he said, but his commitment to the revolution's purity made him incapable of tolerating the ambiguity that governance actually requires. Every deviation from the ideal became evidence of treachery. Every critic became a counter-revolutionary. Every faction within the revolution that disagreed with the committee's direction became, by definition, an enemy of the people. The Girondins, moderate Republicans who had been central to the revolution's early phase, were purged in June 1793 and their leaders guillotined. Danton, who had been one of the revolution's most energetic early voices, and who argued in early 1794 that the terror had served its purpose and should be wound down, was arrested, tried, and executed in April 1794. His crime in the committee's framing was moderation. Asking for less killing was evidence of insufficient commitment to the revolution. Asking for mercy was counter-revolutionary. The machinery had turned on itself. This is the moment that recurs across the history of ideologically driven power, the moment when the movement that began by identifying an external enemy has consumed that enemy and must now find the threat within itself. The purge is not a failure of the revolution. It is, in a terrible sense, its fulfillment. The logic of absolute ideological purity, applied consistently, always arrives here. There is always someone purer. There is always someone whose commitment can be questioned. There is always a more radical position from which the current position looks like compromise. Robespierre understood this. In the abstract, he had watched others fall to it. What he could not see was that the same logic was already being applied to him, that the committee members who had watched Danton fall were already calculating their own survival, already understanding that the mechanism that had consumed so many others would eventually turn toward anyone who stood at the center of it long enough. On the 9th of Thermidor, July 27, 1794, Robespierre was shouted down in the National Convention before he could finish speaking, arrested that evening, and guillotined the following afternoon. He had been the terror's most visible architect. He died by its logic. The terror killed approximately 17,000 people through official execution, and perhaps another 25,000 through summary killings in the provinces. It destroyed many of the revolution's most capable early leaders. It exhausted the French population's tolerance for radical change and created the political conditions that would eventually bring Napoleon Bonaparte to power, a man who offered, above everything else, the promise of order. What the French Revolution demonstrates, across the full arc of its radical phase, is the particular danger of a movement that conflates its ideal with its identity. When the ideal is perfect and the world is imperfect, the explanation is always the same: enemies. And the search for enemies, once institutionalized, becomes self-sustaining and self-perpetuating, consuming first the obvious targets, then the moderate ones, then the allies, then finally the architects themselves. The guillotine did not discriminate between the revolution's enemies and its authors. It could not. It was a machine, and machines follow the logic given to them. The logic given to this one was purity, and purity, pursued without limit, finds imperfection everywhere it looks, including in the mirror.